All right, this is the lecture over page 68 through 83, starting at Africans and Europeans. Europeans had no clue about what abundant life meant in the New World. In the Old World, they had tons of available workers because there was a lot of people, but the land was so scarce because people had been around for a long time and they had taken up all the land. In America, it's the exact opposite. There's no people there to work for them, but there's tons of land. So labor is really expensive in the New World, where land is very cheap. And this has been the opposite in Europe, and they don't know how to fix this situation because people aren't coming over to the New World fast enough. First, Europeans try to enslave Native Americans, but they die from disease and they run away and hide. It's just that simple. Native Americans will help other Native Americans hide, and they are not a suitable labor force. So then come the Africans. European slave traders would show up on the west coast of Africa, tell Africans, "You need to provide me slaves for the next time that I'm here, or I will enslave you." They had no intentions of enslaving those Africans. They wanted the Africans to enslave their own people, to do the work for them. So the Africans on the west coast of Africa would go further in the interior, start a war, and enslave the people after they won. All social ranks were enslaved. Slaves were marched in chains loaded on ships for the brutal Middle Passage. Middle Passage was terrible. Little food, little water, chained up. Many died of disease, and they were thrown overboard to be eaten by sharks if they were alive, or to drown or be eaten by sharks if they were alive, to be drowned or eaten by sharks, or if they were dead, to just be eaten by sharks or just simply float along and float away. Millions of slaves make it from Africa to the New World. Majority of them make it to Brazil. Slavery is always and will be bad. But in America or the English colonies, we didn't actually import that many. About only 5% of slaves were imported from Africa. Majority of them went to the Caribbean or to Brazil. Slavery becomes the main way of work in the southern colonies, and as indentured servants decide not to go to the South because their life expectancy is in the 40s, whereas in the North or New England, you could live up to be 80 years old. So the slaves become way more beneficial. And the great thing about slaves, again, slavery bad, okay, but the thing about slaves is their status is passed from mother to children, so they're a self-reproducing labor force. You have slaves, they make babies, those babies become slaves. You either use them or sell them. If they try to escape, they're easily found. Native Americans will turn them in because Native Americans don't want to have to be enslaved or have to work for a white man again. They're slaves for life. Work is sun up to sundown every day, no break. Brutal working. Slavery was firmly established in the South by 1720 because it met the labor needs of the commercial producing staple crops for the market. One single crop, tobacco, eventually indigo, cotton, but the big one from South Carolina, rice. Slavery was present in every British colony, but few slaves lived in the North because it's not economical. They aren't growing cash crops or staple crops. In the northern areas, they're just working in homes, or they're working on the docks, like in Philadelphia. Most northern farmers are just sustenance farmers, producing food for their families. Slaves aren't useful. Okay, as I mentioned before, Philadelphia, 1 out of 6 residents was a slave in Philadelphia because they're working on the docks. Race relations become more rigid after 1700 with the introduction of laws that restricted the rights of and opportunities for slaves as well as freed blacks. Conditions of the slaves worsen with slave codes, which will come about a little bit later. which reduces an entire class of people to property. And that's the big thing that we need to remember when we're talking about this, is that the mentality of the 1700 and 1800 uh, mind of a Southerner is that these people who are slaves are not people. They're property, they're objects, they're tools. African families and communities emerged with great success in the southern colonies and witnessed the rise of the American-born slave community. But again, they are given very little. Most slaves are worked as lived on plantations and worked as field hands, except for men trained as skilled workers. Women are nurses and cooks. The elderly are usually the ones that are going to raise the children, cook, take care of the slaves, but also take care of the slave owners' children. Slaves lived fragile lives. Communities' lives were forged together through opportunities to preserve American heritage. Marriage was not for love. Marriage was arranged. Marriage was, you were told that this other slave was going to be your partner and you were going to produce children. And if you didn't, there would be consequences. Um, Funerals are a big key to preserving African heritage. Slaves were attracted to Christianity only after the American Revolution, because remember, teaching somebody to read and write gives them knowledge, knowledge gives them power, and they don't want to give power to any of the slaves. Slave owners use the Bible to justify slavery by saying there is slavery in the Bible. True statement. But also, there's a whole lot of things that if you look in the Bible, and again, we're looking at the Bible as just a text. The text in the Bible says that you should treat others how you want to be treated. Love your neighbor as yourself. I mean, these things go completely against the cruel and brutal conditions of slavery. The least and rarest form of resistance is rebellion. The second least form used is running away. Now, eventually, with the Underground Railroad and Harriet Tubman, more and more slaves become successful in escaping and getting away. But even in the grand scheme of things, those numbers are small. The Underground Railroad and Harriet Tubman, yes, were super important. However, they didn't reach millions upon millions of slaves. For those that traveled on the Underground Railroad, for those that worked on the Underground Railroad, these were very important means of escape. But most of the time, the slaves don't know where they're going. They're just going to get caught. Slave resistance that was used all the time. Working slowly, breaking tools, pretending you were too stupid to do the job, pretending you were ill, damaging crops, stealing, setting fire to barns, houses, fields, doing whatever you could to slow up the process. You're going to have to do the work anyways. So you might as well take your time, and as long as you're not getting beat for it and you're working fast enough, you are fine. One of the big rebellions, as I spoke about, the least form used of resistance was the Stoner Rebellion, led by 20 Angolese slaves that had just gotten here from Africa. They wanted to lead a revolt and lead the slaves to Spanish Florida, where they could be free. Unfortunately, the problem with most of the rebellions is that you have to have secrecy, you have to be able to communicate, and just the slave system negates those two things so heavily. The revolt is put down. Indians help. White people die. More slaves are killed than participated in the revolt as retribution for the white people that died. And out of it, stronger slave laws are passed regulating slave activities. European laborers in early America. 1/2 to 2/3 of all white immigrants were indentured servants. Chesapeake planters also transported English convicts, mostly young and lower class men. The Germans are going to use the redemption system. The first person from a family would pay for their voyage over, and then they would work in America until they could afford to use the redemption system where their family, one family member or however many family members they could afford, could get on a ship, and before they would be allowed to get off the ship, the German who was in America would pay for their voyage when they got here. And then again and again and again, they would continue this process until their whole family was over. Owners of undeveloped land rented tracts of land to family to clear the property. Property, even today, that's cleared and ready to be built on is worth way more than property that needs to be leveled and needs trees removed and things of that nature. Merchants wanting to develop fisheries in different regions of the United States will advance credit to fishermen to outfit their boats. And then once that's paid off, they'll move to a wage system with these fishermen and they'll pay them per pound of fish that they bring in. And of course, the owners of the boat will then sell that fish and be the middleman on this, and the fishermen will still get a fair wage, but the owners will as well. Northern farmers use children as laborers. Again, we talked about this not that long ago about how slaves aren't economical. Family members are, so they're going to use family members, and that includes children. Labor systems, you can see here, New England middle colonies for the most part. We're talking about family farms with some indentured servants, but then you get to the South, Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina are all using some form of slavery. Less in North Carolina because of the poor people that live there. European immigrants flooded America in the 17th and 18th century. Scots-Irish, Irish Catholics, German Protestants, all seeking asylum from either political or religious circumstances. They're seeking asylum or refuge from some sort of situation that's going on there. Either they're being persecuted religiously or politically. Most immigrants went to places where land was cheap and in demand. The foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, all the way to western Pennsylvania, all the way to the Carolinas. It doesn't matter. They're going to go to a place, they're going to establish themselves, and then they're going to establish a majority of where their ethnic group becomes that majority. Like Fredericksburg in Texas. There's a large German population in Fredericksburg because that's where they settled in Texas. And so it just depends on where they land, where they find the land, and you'll see an enclave or a big group of that European group. Again, majority of the Europeans that come to America are English, but you have Scots-Irish, German, Irish, Scottish, Dutch, and then of course the second largest group are Africans. That's it for pages 68 through 83. Study for that test.